week's lesson, we're going to explore the factors that contribute to an economy's productive capacity. Very broadly speaking, macroeconomics is divided into two branches of study. One, long-run growth. Two, short-run fluctuations. Long-run growth is what we're concerned about this week. In the long-run growth sector, we study the factors that determine the things that make an economy rich or make an economy poor, or the things that make an economy grow over long periods of time. Essentially, the productive capacities of an economy. The short-run fluctuations, which we'll study later in the semester, in fact, we'll spend most of the semester talking about short-run fluctuations. In this branch of study, we're concerned with why an economy might deviate from its most productive capacity. So, for example, why we have recessions, or why an economy might overheat and go into an inflationary period. Long-run growth is more about the long-run abilities of an economy, what an economy can do efficiently using its resources at the current level of technology. Short-run fluctuations are all about why we might temporarily not be at our most productive capabilities. Before we do that, let's make a distinction between two terms that sound really very similar: production and productivity. Production is about the output level of an economy, the level. Productivity is more about efficiency. It's more about how much output you get per input. The input that we most often use to measure productivity is labor. So we might think about output per labor hour. Of course, these two things are intimately linked. The more productive an economy is, the higher its productivity, the higher is going to be its level of production. And in fact, this is pretty much what distinguishes poorer economies from richer economies. Poor economies have a low level of output, low level of production, and they tend to have low levels of production or output because they also tend to have low productivity. Rich economies, on the other hand, have higher levels of output and higher levels of productivity. Poorer countries tend to have lower levels of productivity because they're not adopting or adapting the best practices. Okay? The incentives, for some reason, and we'll talk about that, the incentives aren't right for developing skills, innovating, and using the best technology. But when poor economies get those incentives correct, they can grow very quickly because poor economies can catch up. They can catch up by adopting the existing technologies. If we think of rich countries being at the frontier, being of the frontier of technological capabilities, poorer countries are somewhere inside the frontier. When they get those incentives right, they can grow very quickly towards the frontier. Countries like Japan, South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, they've done this very successfully in the last 30 years. At some point, they set the environment so the incentives were right, grew very quickly, and became frontier economies. Richer economies tend to grow slower in the long run. We've seen before that a pretty good GDP growth rate for the United States we thought was 2.5% or above. That's because the richer economies grow by pushing out the frontier. Pushing out the frontier requires innovation, new ideas, developing skills. So the rich economies will grow slower in the long run. They'll grow by pushing out the frontier. Poorer countries need to have the incentive structure. They need to have an incentive structure that enables the adoption of skills and technology and innovation to try to reach the frontier. So you see, it's all about the incentives. The rich economies, well, certainly not perfect, tend to have the right incentive structure to encourage people to adopt skills, to develop new ideas, to innovate. And poorer countries tend to have incentives that don't encourage these kinds of activities. The economic environment and the political environment are such that the incentives aren't right. And this is what we'll want to discuss in class. We want to talk about the kinds of things that change the incentives, or the kinds of environment that get the right incentives in place. As you do this week's reading, think about these things. Think about the things that matter for an efficient level of production and productivity, and an environment that has the right incentives. Thanks, and enjoy.